Well, hey there, you're on the internet. Please excuse the bandages, and welcome to the Triple N Network, where all you newbie nerds can find all the news you'll need. Let's look at an ink today, shall we? Now, today's ink is pink. Yep. And if you're familiar with my videos, I've made no secret of the fact that I hate pink. I hate pink. Made worse by the fact that I am what is referred to as a girl, and therefore I've been given pink things my whole life, despite the fact that it's entirely unflattering. Yeah, so it's pink, but you know, other people love pink. So here we are. Now, if I am not sounding super enthusiastic about this ink, that's got, it's because it's not my deal. But yeah, today's pink ink is by Private Reserve. It is Arabian Rose. And a couple of interesting qualities about this ink. First of all, when it goes on, it has a slightly more intense, like bright, vibrant color, and it is very, very pink looking. However, as it dries, it sort of loses some of that intensity, turns purple, like more purple, and almost starts to look thin in spots, which is interesting. Maybe I'll reload a pen with it, or God forbid, and add a clip at the end, if so. But yeah, it's an interesting quality. So it almost sort of changes colors as it dries. Also, since, as I've said, I'm not a big, fan of pink, or pinky purples, or purpley pinks, I went into this ink testing like, oh, well, okay, let's get through this. But there was an interesting quality to this ink that I was not expecting, and that's that it has some water resistance, which, first of all, you don't often see in a pink ink. And when you do, it's a very aggressive pink ink, like Cape Cod Cranberry, or Qinshi Huang, or something like that. So the fact that we have this soft purpley pink, and it has some water resistance, actually kind of surprised me. So if you're someone who likes pink, and would like at least a little water resistance, keep watching. Now the two pens I used were these. This is a Knox Avicenna in broad, and it's generally on the wet side, so there's that. And then this Retro 51 Tornado, which has a European fine nib and is probably one of the drier writing pens that I own. So, yeah, so there are the pens. Oh great, I just had a hiccup. Let's see how this goes. So here's Private Reserve Arabian Rose. And here is Pelikan's 4001 Violet, or purple. I actually don't know which one it is, but quite similar. This one's maybe a bit darker, just a touch more blue. Here's Géovan's L'Âme de Cassis. L'Âme de Cassis. Quite similar. Quite similar. This one's maybe a bit lighter, maybe a touch more pink. Here's Diamine's Amazing Amethyst, which, yes, is much more blue, but sort of the lighter areas through here kind of reminded me of some of the darker areas through here. And, whoa, actually the camera's super increasing the difference in blue here. But, yeah. And here's KWZ's Gummy Berry, which is very purple, but I don't know. Something about it kind of reminded me of it. Truth is, I don't have many sample or swatches that are quite like this. But, yeah, so I found the best I could, but alright, so bear with me as I zoom in, because we're going to look at some chromatography. Yeah, so there we go. Now the one on the left with the D is the one that I let dry, but as you can probably tell, there's not a whole lot of difference between the two. But if you're asking what this dotted line is, that's where the water stopped. So the ink stopped, here, but the water kept seeping up the strip until right around here. So that's a quality that we often see in more water-resistant inks. Like a lot of the Noodler's black inks will do something like this, where the ink will stop and then the water will keep going. So just thought I should point that out. And since I do these before I begin the test, this was an indicator that there might be something to this ink that I hadn't been expecting. But yeah, on both you can see there's a very distinct, like it's noticeable where that first drop is. The ink is fighting being pushed up, and as you might see through here, this is quite pink. And then just at the edges along here, we see more of a hint of a purple. But yeah, so interesting chromatography. Zooming out now. Okay. And now let's look at some chemical tests. I never know what to call them because, you know, it's a water test, but then there are some chemical elements. Yeah, water broken up a bit, but as you can see, like, you can see where that initial line was, where this smear was. It didn't get rid of everything. And this 1/3 bleach solution, yes, it largely got rid of it, but when I first put it on, it turned this very violety bluish purple before slowly disappearing, which I thought was interesting. Now, ammonia pen flush, much like water, you can still definitely see where that initial line was, but it did get things moving. And hydrogen peroxide, yeah, it kind of did the same, but it also started to react with the paper, so I tried to soak it up kind of quickly. Now, onto the paper test, top-down density, Clairefontaine 90 grams per square meter. Now, as you might be able to see here, there is, it's almost like a thinness, like a wateriness or an undersaturation to this, because generally I prefer quadrilateral paper. Dot paper is just not enough of a guide for me because I instinctually just sort of want to start writing like a bell curve or something. So I don't personally like it when I can see these lines through the ink. However, when you do have an ink that has this sort of thinness or decreased below average saturation, whatever politically correct way of saying it is, we do get a lot of shading. So as you can see down here where it's quite light, we get medium, then we get it quite dark. So if you like this sort of like soft, dusty pink purple, and you want some shading, definitely look into it. And again, it's kind of fun when you write with an ink and it goes on one color and then it changes as it dries. But I don't know, that's the Harry Potter fan in me, you know, when he bought the bottle of ink that changed color and it cheered him up. But anyways, that Western Fine, although it's fairly dry, it took 12 seconds, and you can see the smear is not tiny. And that Broad Avicenna took 23. But yeah, it's very well behaved. There's no bleed, no feather, no spread, no echo, no sheen. Something that I did want to mention though is it dried on the nib, both nibs, fairly quickly. So as I was switching between them, so I did this with the Broad, and then I put it down and I picked up the Fine to do this. And as you might notice, when I picked up the Broad again, it got quite dark, and that's because just in the time it took me to write these 3 lines, it started to dry on the nib, and it got a bit darker. But I kind of like the way this looks more than this. But yeah, so I don't know, if there was a way I could sort of, I don't know, condense this ink just a little bit, maybe I'd like it a bit more. But yeah, now, as I said, it's very hard to get pink inks to be water resistant. I can think of almost none that aren't super aggressive, like the Noodler's ones that I mentioned. But I just want to bring this in. Here with this Broad, you can read most of that. And these dots are super clear. Now again, this Western Fine is one of the driest writing pens that I own. So yeah, I mean, admittedly, after I did the chromatography and I was thinking, oh, maybe there's some water resistance to this. When I saw this, I was like, oh, maybe I was wrong. We'll get into it. Now, next up is Fabriano Eco Qua. It's an 85 gram per square meter paper. It's totally chlorine free. It's supported by the like United Forestry Service or whatever because it's renewable or something. I don't know. It's a great paper. It's my favorite paper to write on. It has an interesting texture. I highly recommend it. It can be found online and in a lot of art stores. Like here in the San Francisco area, it's at Artisan Craftsman, it's at Flax, it's at Blick, it's at a bunch of places. I really recommend you give it a try. However, if you are a fan of dot paper, just something to point out. So this is 5mm grid. As you might be able to tell, the dots are 4mm spaced. So there's something to keep in mind. I don't want that to surprise anyone, but I do highly recommend this paper. I don't know how to describe it, it's almost spongy. So like when you press the nib into it, it sort of sinks in, and then it has a bit of a texture to it. So if you like broad nibs like I do, which tend to have baby's bottom, sort of the little, like almost like microscopic little ridges of the paper texture sort of poking up, helps sort of like reach into that baby's bottom and sort of draw the ink out. So honestly, this paper is lovely. It's lovely. And it tends to be able to handle inks that sometimes even Clairefontaine and Rhodia struggle with a little bit. So honestly, I I highly suggest you give it a try. I really like Fabriano paper. Yeah, it's great. But anyways, back to the ink. The fairly dry writing Western Fine took 13 seconds. The fairly wet Avicenna and Broad took 26, but again, we can see the dots through here a little bit, but yeah, again, we get some very nice shading. I mean, that is one of the things about, you know, undersaturated or less saturated inks, is we do get more of a contrast between where the ink's been put on very heavily and where it's not. But yeah, so like the dry writing Fine, we don't get as much of it and it's much lighter. But yeah. Anyways, here I say it's probably a 5.5 out of 10. It is just slightly wet. I think if it wasn't this this fine nib would probably just drive me crazy. But yeah, no bleed, no feather, no spread, no echo, no sheen. And here is kind of what I was talking about. Now, is it completely water resistant? No. But look, even that dry writing Fine, which really wasn't putting much ink down, and that only had maybe 20 minutes to seep into this paper, you can still kind of read that. Is it super easy? No. But here in this Broad, yeah, you can read that. That's recoverable. That's hard to find in a pink ink. Yeah, so just saying. Now, next up is Rhodia, 80 grams per square meter. Lots of people are familiar with this stuff, so I won't go into a whole speech about it. But yeah, 12 seconds to dry on that fairly dry Western Fine in the Tornado, and 23 seconds in that slightly wet Knox Avicenna and Broad. But again, we can see all the lines from the quadrilateral paper, which is, again, not my preference, but we do get some very nice shading, nice degree of shading from sort of the wetter parts, like here. And again, this is where it kind of dried, because I wrote it there, put it down to write this, and when I picked it up again, it got a bit dark. But we do have some nice shading. If you like the sort of like soft purpley pinks, this would definitely be something to look into. This could totally be something you didn't know you were looking for. But yeah, no bleed, no feather, no spread, no echo, no sheen. Very good in that regard. And once again, we actually have more remaining than I thought. And again, that Broad, there's a lot there, and it's pretty readable. And if you notice, it didn't dye the page. Really not bad. That would be recoverable, I think. Now, next up is Tomoe River paper, which is known for drawing out shading and sheen and dry times and echo. But yeah, so we definitely got the drawn out dry times. That Western Fine took 20 seconds, even though it's fairly dry writing. But that kind of wet Knox Avicenna and Broad took more than 30, and I guess on that day I didn't feel like counting beyond 30. But man, look at that smear. Went right off the page. But yeah, I mean, this is Tomoe River. It does show you the wide breadth of shading, and admittedly, in some areas, it does look incredibly thin. But in some areas, it does get fairly dark, and we do get a bit of a halo outline around the wettest parts. And admittedly, you know, again, it did kind of dry on the nib, so when I wrote this line and then put it down to write this and then picked it up again, it is kind of darker around here, but still. Now, echo, I don't really, okay, yes, there's some in the scrubby, but compared to what we usually see, there's really not much. And I think that's in part because this is a fairly light pink and it is slightly undersaturated. So if you're super sensitive to echo, like I am, but you compulsively want to write on both sides of the page and you like pink, this could be good. Especially if you know Tomoe River and how it loves to let ink slide away when you add more water. This surprised me. I mean, seriously, I've seen this paper just absolutely wash away inks as if they were never there. So the fact that this is a pink ink and there is so much left. I mean, look at this Fine, this dry writing Fine. You can read that. That is not the camera increasing contrast. That is absolutely accurate. If you had to recover that, you could. And again, this was on this paper maybe 20 minutes. Well, 20 minutes, maybe 30. That's not long. Now, here is the world's worst 20-pound copier paper. It is probably the worst paper I've ever encountered, and that is really saying something. So chances are you have something at least to step up from this. But, yeah, this stuff is terrible. Let's look at the spread. So here's Tomoe River where there's no spread. Here's that Fine on here. Yeah, we get a definite increase in line width. Like in some places it's almost as big as that Broad nib. Speaking of the Broad nib, on all these cheaper papers, I only used the Fine to write the test, except to write the name. So this is written with that Broad Avicenna. But yeah, as you can tell, there's a wooliness. You know, there's like kind of a texture, but there's not really any shading anymore. It does feather a bit, but like not a ton. Like, you know, we look at the bottom of the letters in quick. You see a little feathering, but not a lot in the writing, which kind of surprised me because, as I said, this is probably some of the worst paper I've ever encountered. So there's spread, not a lot of feathering. There's woolliness, but there's also not a lot of bleed. Now, yes, it is a dry writing fine, but still, they're like up here. So that's the kind of wet Knox and broad. That makes sense. But all through here, and if you notice, see how it gets very dark up here and then it gets lighter? I think that's partly paper exposure to air, so it's really not so bad. Honestly, maybe a Japanese fine would do wonderfully. I have no idea, but now look at this. Now, more absorbent papers tend to draw the ink in, make it harder to wash out, but a lot of times on this paper will just freak out when you add water. It didn't. I mean, it did physically. It actually like pillowed up. You can actually see where the paper like physically started to like bend itself. But look at this. It turned slightly purple and some of the pink qualities washed away. But look, it didn't feather, didn't explode, didn't spread. That is absolutely recoverable. You can read that very, very easily. And I just totally knocked the camera. My apologies. Yeah. And look, not much of it is coming out the back, at least not more than what was before. That's pretty impressive. Again, worst paper I've ever encountered. Now, next up is Mead Notebook Paper, which is very common for school children in the United States. And this is the type that you would find in like a spiral notebook, not the kind you'd find in like a lab notebook or a composition notebook. That kind of paper has almost a newsprint quality. This stuff, honestly, lately it's been feathering like crazy, which is why this caught my attention. The lack of feathers. There's like a bit of a woolly texture in some spots, but really like essentially no feathers, especially compared to what we usually see. I mean, it's doing really well, and as you can tell, there's actually even a little bit of shading on here. And you can see it in places in the writing as well. That surprised me. Now, 2.5 seconds to dry. Now, because this is a fairly light color of ink, and, you know, it's not super saturated in the first place, we get almost no echo, and where we do, it's in the scrubby. There's no bleed at all whatsoever. Not even in the scrubby. I mean, that's really not bad. So if you are like a student and you love pink inks and you know, use this paper, great. I mean, it's not feathering on paper that usually takes any opportunity to feather. And look at this. I mean, if you've even just seen any of the tests from this past week, this paper loves to freak out when you add water. It starts to look like furry cactus monsters. Not here. It turned more purple, but it still didn't feather. It still didn't super spread. It still didn't explode and become unreadable. That is totally recoverable. I was impressed. And again, I hate pink ink, so that's actually something I'm begrudgingly admitting, but still. Okay. I know how to undo all of that because it's Moleskine time. I hate this stuff. I really do. It's absolutely awful paper, and they make you pay a lot of money for it. I mean, do I even have to bring this in any closer? You can already see the gross woolly texture. You can see the pattern of the pulp that they just mushed into paper. Took 4 seconds to dry. There's like this gross quality to it. Like, ugh. I mean, anyways, yeah, there's feathering. There's spots of feathering that are just kind of ridiculous. There's lots of bleed. I mean, even Mead, which like you can barely even see it in some spots because it's a dry writing fine. And then we get this, where like a bunch of these tiny little spots, I want it to focus so you can see just how dark they are. Because yeah, not only do they reach the other side, they came through. They've peppered the page below. That is not cool. And a notebook about this size costs what, like $12, $13, $14, $15? I don't know. But yeah. And for once, the water test freaked out. World's worst paper. Totally readable. Didn't freak out. Mead, which you can get like an entire ream of for like, what, $4? And we get this on Moleskine. Look at this. Look, like half of it wanted to disappear. Like that part of the W, gone. Top of the A, gone. Middle of the T, gone. Like, what is this? It like half dissolved, half didn't. Feathered, got extra woolly. Like, I really hate ending on Moleskine. It puts me in such a bad mood. But, yeah, if you're like me, and there was a time when you didn't know better and you thought Moleskine was a really great notebook, please consider yourself educated because it's terrible. It's terrible stuff. But yeah, so there you go for your consideration. Private Reserve Arabian Rose. It's an interesting ink. It does extremely well on cheap paper, not counting Moleskine because it's expensive but cheaply made. Now, its performance on Mead, seriously impressive, especially this Mead, which just wants to feather. Worst copier paper I've ever encountered. Yeah, it spread, but it didn't feather, didn't freak out. Like, honestly, and again, I'm begrudgingly admitting this because I don't like pink, this is really something, I gotta admit. Is it super saturated? No. Does it sheen? No. But it readily flows. It's got some qualities to it that might be worth looking into if you're an admirer of pink. Especially if you're looking for a pink that has some water resistance. So, yeah. Anyways, there you go for your consideration from the Triple N Network. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe to the channel. And thanks for watching. Bye.